First of all, I think it's gotten worse in the last 5 years. I mean, in 2017, Boulder had double the number of shelter beds. Most people don't realize this. It was a conscious decision of the city to cut the number of shelter beds in half and to get rid of these low barrier shelters where you could show up as you were, and as long as you weren't being violent, you would be taken in and given a safe place to sleep. When they're turned away, they're given a blanket so they can survive overnight. And the irony of it is that it's against the city's law for them to use the blanket to cover themselves to survive when they're turned away from the shelter because it's full. You know, if a patient's in the hospital and they need surgery, you wouldn't have a community meeting to decide what the best way to do the surgery is. You know, you would ask a surgeon, maybe ask two surgeons to give their ideas and have a conference and then come up with a plan. In Houston and in other cities, you know, the city governments have been eager for that, have been eager for coalitions of service providers to come inform the city about the best ways and the things to fund to move people off the streets, out of encampments, into safe places.
Hello, Boulder and the wider world. This is the Sharing Boulder podcast. My name is Philip Ogren, and for episode 44, I spoke with Dan Williams, who is a civil rights lawyer who has worked on issues related to homelessness in Boulder. We talked about a recent effort by a consortium of service providers who got together and created a detailed proposal for providing low-barrier services. This proposal was submitted to City Council and was sidelined in favor of a city process which has emphasized community feedback over expert opinion. I admire Dan for his tenacious advocacy for helping bring meaningful solutions for homelessness in our community, and for his historical perspective that helps us understand how we got to where we are now. Dan pulls no punches in this short but informative interview. I hope you enjoyed this interview with Dan Williams.
We ain't throwing starfish here, now we're having a good party. Talking about structural change. We believe the land is sacred, even beneath that vacant parking lot, where the weeds are doing their best to express the need for something different. Gonna make some space for you and me to live here all together. Gonna make it safe and fun for kids to get around the town. Gonna find me a residential pedestrian district where I can gracefully grow older. Gonna spend my remaining years sharing Boulder.
Programming note. To the listeners who consider themselves audiophiles, and perhaps even those who don't, it may be painfully obvious that this episode was not edited by Katie Avery, who has edited the last 4 episodes. If you appreciate the higher quality of the recent episodes, then please send me a note that I can share with her. The podcast has recently gotten more expensive to produce, and I am contemplating ways to accept donations for producing the podcast. Stay tuned. Dan, welcome back to Sharing Boulder. It's it's nice to have you back on the show. Please take a minute to introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Dan Williams. I'm a lawyer here in Boulder. Lived here for about 16, 17 years. I work on just a broad range of litigation, including civil rights litigation. I've dealt a lot with issues around homelessness and police interactions with marginalized groups in Boulder and elsewhere. We spoke before when I was running for city council in 2021. Did not prevail on my race, but so here I am continuing to practice law.
Great. Well, thank you for your service. This is, the way we talked about this is supposed to be a mini episode. We'll see if we can keep it short or not. I don't really have a time constraint, but we had kind of a focus thing we want to talk about today, and this came up most recently at Waylon Lewis's campaign launch party. He was talking about an article he had read in probably the New York Times about Houston and the way they have tackled homelessness. And he was saying that the secret sauce that Houston discovered is that if you can get all of your service providers in the same room and get them communicating and collaborating and helping each other out. I didn't actually take time to read the article. I'm sorry, but that that was their secret sauce. That was what made the help them make progress on this issue in their city. And so I was standing next to you when he was summarizing that article, and I was like, well, is this possible? And you're like, yeah, this is. Well, yeah, I don't know if you said yes or no. You were just like, I've got lots to say about this, and so honestly, I just want to hear what you have to say about this. Yeah. So,
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, for at least the last 3 or 4 years, so many people have expressed so many views in Boulder about what to do about homelessness, and people come at it from different perspectives. My own view is we should talk to people who have expertise in helping people move out of homelessness and in actually, addressing the problems that have people living unsheltered or living without permanent, stable places. Um, and what was happening in Boulder, I guess, shortly after the last election, so in January of 2022, there was a thought that this new city council might really want to start tackling homelessness in innovative ways and in new ways that hadn't been done. The service providers in town typically had not acted as a cohesive group in terms of coming up with policy suggestions. So there are about half a dozen organizations in town that work with people who are unhoused. And I was asked to help facilitate some meetings of that group to see if that group could come up with a consensus proposal to submit to the city for a day shelter and additional night sheltering options that are so-called low barrier. So, what does that mean? A low barrier shelter is a shelter where, people may not love that someone is drunk or on drugs, but the idea is, well, it's still safer to have them sleeping in a safe place indoors. So we're going to have a shelter where people are who they are, they have the problems that they have, and there's a safe place for them to show up and maybe, get some food and wash and be taken care of. And that's actually a recognition that getting out of homelessness is a process. The first step isn't the last step. So the first step may just be going to a shelter, and then the next step might be getting sober or reconnecting with family. But you meet people where they are. So anyway, this group of providers said, look, if this council is really interested in doing something new, meeting people where they are, why don't we just submit a proposal to them that they could just fund? So we did. We spent 2 days. This was a group that had very different viewpoints, which quite honestly, there were some parts of the group where there was a lack of trust. And it took a lot of work.
between members of different organizations.
Yeah, right, executive directors of different organizations. And, the first step really was talking about what brought everyone to the work. Why did each of these executive directors dedicate their professional life to working with unhoused people? And then moving on from there, how could we design something that would be just a great asset, a place for people to be at night and a place for people to be during the day? And over the course of 2 days, we hashed out a very detailed proposal, submitted it to City Council, emailed it to the members of council, to the city's Department of Human Services, to the city manager, to a few others.
That's a public document then that exists somewhere.
It is.
In the
Yep.
materials
And I'd be happy to share it with you or with anyone else.
Right.
The hope was that council would adopt it, would fund it. It was, it was somewhere between $1 and $2 million. So not an overwhelming amount of money. Certainly the amount of money the city could have found in the budget. What happened with the plan, much to our disappointment, was essentially nothing. This new council asked the city staff to review it. I think it didn't align with some of the desires of Boulder's current city staff, specifically the city's human services department. Didn't want to cede this control to the provider community. And instead, they sent out a request for proposals of their own with their own vision, which wasn't the vision shared by the provider community. And, not surprisingly, they got a very, very tepid reaction. No one submitted a proposal to do what the Human Services Department, asked for proposals for. One person had a proposal to do just a small portion of it. Nothing happened, nothing got funded, and that was the end of it. But I think what we were talking about at Waylands and what I thought was interesting about it was that in Houston and in other cities, the city governments have been eager for that, have been eager for coalitions of service providers to come inform the city about the best ways and the things to fund to move people off the streets, out of encampments, into safe places. But in Boulder, that was stymied by a sense that either the city staff or its councils knew better, even though they really, frankly, weren't specialists in the area. And the net result has been essentially no change in the last 2 years.
Well, it's a difficult problem, right? And you were talking about before we hit the record button about how everyone comes at this with strong opinions and strong emotional response to their experiences with homeless people, and they show up with ideas about how to solve it, and it's like I don't know, there's a lot of hubris around like how easy it should be to solve it, right? And or what the obvious path is. And I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me to get the experts in one room and ask them what's working and what's not working, and see if they can collaborate better, and like ask their opinion about what they need and what kind of support the city could give them. So what's next for this?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the one thing the council did do shortly after the proposal was submitted was say they wanted to launch a process to establish a day center. So that was in January of 2022, and here we are in September of 2023. What the city's process was that sort of throw it open to everybody for their ideas. The city held a ton of focus groups and community meetings and really talked to a lot of non-experts and tried to find a compromise plan. And I don't think it yielded it certainly didn't yield a solution that was actionable, because here we are. The latest information I have is that there's no date for opening of a day shelter. There is a plan, but
There's an address still, right? There was.
That no longer is available. I don't know what caused that to fall through, but no. So no, there, as I say, there are plans and ideas, but we're still a year and 10 months later, or a year and 9 months later, do not have a day shelter, and we don't have a date for an opening of a day shelter. And frankly, today we don't even have a location for a day shelter. And I think it's sort of like, if a patient's in the hospital and they need surgery, you wouldn't have a community meeting to decide what the best way to do the surgery is. You would ask a surgeon, maybe ask two surgeons to give their ideas and have a conference and then come up with a plan. But that hasn't been the approach Boulder has adopted. Boulder's adopted an approach where they want to give everybody, a crowdsourced plan. And that is ultimately, I think, ineffective for these really tough problems like homelessness, like open heart surgery. They're not things that are better handled via crowdsourcing. So, it's disappointing to me that Boulder hasn't been able to be more nimble. I think part of that is, you look at what Mike Johnston's doing in Denver. Very interesting. I mean, he was just elected over first half of the summer, declared a statewide or a citywide emergency on homelessness, declared that he was going to establish 1,000 places for people, 1,000 residences for people by the end of the calendar year, whether that be in safe outdoor spaces, pallet shelters, whether that be in a hotel that the city's buying to convert, or otherwise. It's a very, very ambitious plan, and one thing that would not work is if Denver said, before we do anything, before we buy a hotel and convert it, before we set up a
Yeah,
site.
get buy-in from everybody who might have an opinion about this.
Right. There's no way that in 6 months or 3 months you could create 1,000 indoor places for people to sleep. And I think people in Boulder lose sight of the opportunity cost of our system of crowdsourcing each of these decisions, because the opportunity cost is for the last almost 2 years, people are sleeping outside with nowhere to go. 200 people a year go to the Boulder Shelter for the Homeless up in North Boulder and are turned away because it's at capacity, typically in the winter. And when they're turned away, they're given a blanket so they can survive overnight. And the irony of it is that it's against the city's law for them to use the blanket to cover themselves to survive when they're turned away from the shelter because it's full. So I get that it's helpful to get community buy-in on issues, but when the cost of that is literally people freezing to death like we have year over year in Boulder, to me that cost is too high, and this is an issue that demands action.
Yeah, well, I would just correct you on one thing. It's like it's been more than 2 years. I mean, I know what you're saying, since 2 years since the proposal, but like I was thinking the other day, like my kids have always known homelessness in Boulder. They've grown up here. Since I've been in Boulder, since 2002, it's always been part of the fabric of the city. It's like part of the character of the city. It's like we've just sort of like accepted it that every year we're gonna argue about it and hold our positions on it, and we have this analysis paralysis, and I don't know. It's like it's very and I know there's lots of things that people are trying to do. Aaron Brockett talked about the CARE program, which will be a non-police response, and I don't know what's holding that up, but it sounds like there's some staffing. Finding the right kind of staffing is difficult, and I want to be hopeful that program can be effective. I also want to be hopeful that maybe this coalition that you mentioned can turn around and try again with the next city council. Is there any buzz about that possibility?
Those discussions haven't happened yet, but I will say that the people who dedicate their lives to working with unsheltered, unhoused people, they do it because they care, and I don't think it would be that hard to reassemble the group or whatever the current group looks like in early 2024 and say, yeah, we have new people on council, it's time, let's do this again. But I think with Boulder in specific, there are a lot of myths that Boulder tells itself that has it accept the homeless crisis that we've had here for so long. First of all, I think it's gotten worse in the last 5 years. I mean, in 2017, Boulder had double the number of shelter beds. Most people don't realize this. It was a conscious decision of the city to cut the number of shelter beds in half and to get rid of these low barrier shelters where you could show up as you were, and as long as you weren't being violent, you would be taken in and given a safe place to sleep. The idea was we want to force people into services, and the way to do that is essentially through tough love. And we're going to have a limited number of shelter beds and put our resources into other affordable housing programs. And the net result has been many, many, many more people living outside in Central Park and in the watersheds around Boulder. And I think there's general consensus around the city that we're worse off than we were. But these myths that we tell ourselves about why people are sleeping outside are, I think one of the reasons we don't work harder to change this quickly. So, one of them is you hear that, and you hear it because the police department says it and the city government says it, that people are sleeping outside because they're service resistant. And one thing I think is interesting about that is that in Denver, they actually did a survey to find out, why are people not going to shelters? Why are people sleeping outside? And what they found is that about 90% of unhoused people in Denver would rather be housed. Some of them say shelters don't work for me, for lots of reasons. I have a partner, I can't sleep with my partner at the shelter. I'm scared to be in a giant room of bunk beds. That's not something I, can do. But I would rather be inside. I mean, I would rather be, in a tiny home, in a tent, in an apartment, in a sanctioned campground. I don't want to be just unsheltered outside. I have a pet, so that might be why I don't want to go to a shelter. Yeah. Other people, so there is a small group that probably doesn't want to get any help, but 90%, I mean the vast majority, do not want to be living rough, living outside unsheltered. In Boulder, maybe Denver is unique, but I heard from the director of Boulder Shelter for the Homeless virtually the same statistic. He said, I think it was 85% was his statistic, of people would rather be inside than living rough, than sleeping outside with nowhere to live, nowhere to be. So that's one myth that we tell ourselves that allows us to walk on Boulder Creek Path and just say, this isn't our fault that people are living like this. This is their fault. They just won't take the help that's there. So, that's not true. The other myth is that Boulder has just a huge range of services to help people who are homeless. There are services in Boulder, which is great, but one service there isn't is housing. I mean, if you say, why is someone living outside? I mean, Boulder, we're not a community that provides housing opportunities for the, roughly, the city just did a survey last July and found around 175 people sleeping unsheltered. We're not a city that has a place for those 175 people to be. We should be, we could be. I think there's this idea that why should Boulder do more?
Yeah.
And that we do, given that we do more than some cities. We may do more than, to pick on a city, than, let's say, Louisville. Okay, why should we do more than Louisville? I mean, part of the answer is you look at the data on what drives homelessness, and there's certain things that correlate with homelessness, like mental illness, like substance abuse, but what actually drives it? Because you have substance abuse, take a state like West Virginia, where the ground zero of the opioid crisis. Yep. They didn't have a homelessness crisis like we have. What drives homelessness is rent prices. So what the data show is for every $100 of rent increases, X number of additional people become homeless. And Boulder, with the highest property values around, disproportionately is creating homelessness. So the idea that we should disproportionately address the problem just seems fair. Certainly the homeowners in Boulder benefit from the high property values. Particularly if they've lived here for some time and they've seen the benefit of that appreciation. But this is an externality, this is the cost. And I do think it's fair for Boulder to do more to address a problem that, not intentionally, but through what we've created here, through high housing prices that we've created.
Well, I wanted you to circle back on that decision that you talked about in 2017. If you could put a little meat or a little detail on what happened there. I'd be curious, like in particular, if there were city council candidates that are running now that, I guess there's not many. Aaron and Bob perhaps would have been there in 2017. So yeah, what do you have the details of what happened and how that vote shook out?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know the details of the politics of it. What I do know is that the direction that was decided was that we need people to go through a coordinated entry program to get any access to any shelter, because if we send people through this coordinated entry registration process, the idea is you can keep track of them, and I think that the idea was a fine one, which is then we can maybe try to help people, connect them with services. But the way it's played out is you've just constricted the entry point to get services. I mean, let's take someone who has a substance abuse problem and is living outside. I think anyone who knows people with substance abuse issues, which is probably most of us, understands that what you want to do with someone with substance abuse is be ready to help them when they're ready to be helped. So, how do you do that? You just create lots of different opportunities for them to accept help. And when they won't accept help, even if that's frustrating, it's one of the things that we just have to learn to accept, because we love them, and not accept it like condone it, because we don't, but accept it like we know that it's a long process, and being there when they're ready is what's critical. So how that applies to coordinated entry is if you're mandating that the only way to have access to support services is through this one entry point that, among other things, requires you to be sober to enter Boulder Shelter for the Homeless, you're just going to leave many, many more people disconnected and farther away from getting help living outside. The other thought was that the solution to homelessness is housing, which is true. But that led some to say spending money on sheltering is essentially wasting money, that you're, essentially spending
Taking
money
it
on
away.
band-aids rather than, stitching up the wound. But the problem is we as a city don't have enough housing for all the people who are here. So if we did, it might be reasonable to have diverted resources that way, but it's not like someone can go to coordinated entry and get into a tiny home or get into a safe outdoor spaces campsite. Or during the winter when it's freezing out, be even guaranteed a bed at Boulder Shelter for the homeless. We don't have those resources for people. So I think what happened was what started off as a reasonable idea was just implemented in a way that made the problem worse, not better.
Ouch. Well, man, that's a tough lesson to learn because we all we're all thinking about it, right? And we're all angry, and we all have ideas about what needs to happen next. And um, it's helpful, I think, to at least take a little bit of historical perspective on what's occurred here in the city to get to where we are. What I'm kind of curious, like, other than reconvene the coalition you mentioned earlier, and um, follow their advice. Maybe that's the answer. But what advice would you give to Waylon Lewis as he contemplates service on city council if he gets in?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few things. One is, a lot of people like to say it's popular now to say I follow the data,
Yeah.
and I think it's important for us to look at where the facts really are. There's a general feeling. A lot of people feel insecure in Boulder right now. A lot of people who are housed feel insecure. They feel unsafe when they walk about in town, and that's not. Obviously, people's feelings are valid, but they're not always data driven. And in fact, Boulder has been and remains a safe place to live, and it's safer in 2023 than it was in 2022. And it's safer in 2022 than it was in 2021. Things are actually trending in the right direction. Bike thefts are trending down. And I think our politicians don't like to say that because they feel like they're dismissing people's feelings.
Yeah.
But sometimes we have to be told hard truths. Like, I respect how you feel, but it actually doesn't align with the facts. A couple days ago, I had a cough.
Well, I don't quite understand where you're going right now because
Yeah,
you're kind of, are you trying to make it sound like, hey, things are on the right track and not to worry about it? Because that was sort of the anecdotes you gave, but
yeah.
I don't think that's what you're saying.
I think we can address homelessness without villainizing the people who are living outside.
Yeah.
And I think people are, I think there's a sense among many house people that the people who are living outside are, criminals who are threatening their personal safety. And, you know, I think for a lot of reasons it's bad to have people living unsheltered outside. It's not good for them. It's not good for the public places. And it does lead to some confrontations that are, wrong. Um, but the fact is, fundamentally, the problem here is that in this land of plenty, in one of the wealthiest cities in the country and one of the wealthiest countries in the world, we have so stratified income that some people are living with nothing and some people are living with an abundance of riches. And we need to, as a society, look at that and not blame the people who are living with nothing as much as find ladders and find pathways so that people can have places to live. And we shouldn't let our fears of others prevent us from doing the right thing and taking care of each other.
Yeah, there's a kind of funny, like, we tell ourselves all these different narratives, and one of them is that if you want to go out and make money, there's sort of like unlimited opportunity to go make lots of money, and the sky's the limit. You could go be a billionaire if you hit the market right and do that thing. And then there's also, so there's like sometimes you get, and that kind of falls under this umbrella of like, the prosperity gospel is not quite the right phrase for that, but there's this whole mindset that like the world just has so much to give us and we can take as much as we want, and this I think gets bantered around in circles where people want to retire early, and they're talking about economic growth and how much abundance there is, and then there's also this narrative of like, we don't have enough for all these people. We can't fund these services. Like, there's an overwhelming amount of need, and there's not nearly enough for that the world can offer, and it just feels like both of those are lies that we like to tell ourselves. And the truth is, it feels like Boulder has this incredible capacity to it has a very thriving economy, and we have a lot of ability to provide for a lot of people. Like, yeah, sure, we can't solve the world's poverty problem, but honestly, like, we could probably solve homelessness in Boulder County if we set our mind to it.
Right, and there may be a person who won't come inside, but the reality is if we could solve 80% of the problem, it would make an enormous difference for people living outside. It would make an enormous difference for the housed people. So, well, I'd love to, get to zero unhoused people. Realistically, if we could, knock out 80-90% of the problem, we
Yeah.
will have made the entire community better for everybody. So,
Well, that's the 80-20 rule, right? Is like, if we went for 100%, it's going to be a lot more effort than if we go for 80%. Just generally speaking, that's how these things work. But
right, and let's spend a couple years doing that, right? And then
yeah,
look
and
see
then 2 years
what's
from now, we
next.
can like worry about the remaining 20%.
Yeah.
Well, I would love to have another episode with you 2 years from now where we discuss how to Boulder's best strategy for solving the remaining 20%. Would that
Yeah.
be amazing?
Well, I will spend the next 2 years work doing my part to see if I
Okay.
can, improve Boulder's systems for unhoused people.
Well, thank you for your service, Dan, and for educating me on a little bit about Boulder politics and the history around this issue. So, thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me.
You bet.
Gonna find me a residential pedestrian district where I can gracefully grow older. Gonna spend my remaining years sharing Boulder.
Thank you for listening to Sharing Boulder. Please support the podcast by sharing it with your friends and neighbors. You can contact me at linktree.com/philipogren, which you can find by visiting sharingboulder.us, where you can also find show notes and previous episodes. This episode of Sharing Boulder was produced and edited by Philip Ogren. The music was created by Nathaniel Ogren and Sack Lunch. Keep sharing, Boulder.